Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this great conversation. My name is Brandy Shupatinsky. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Today, we're going to have a conversation about Black Jewish perspectives and a discussion on the tensions between Black Americans and Jews. And I'm super excited for this conversation and for our wonderful, brilliant panel. So please help get ready. Help me welcome Chaya Lev.
Hi, Brandy.
Hi. And if you could, please introduce yourself.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's quite an honor to be with such amazing voices and leaders in our community. My name is Chaya Lev. I live in Jerusalem currently. I've lived in Israel almost 7 years. I am a dance creator and vibe maker, and I am a Jewish woman, a Black woman, an American woman, an Israeli woman, trying to be the change or be who I want to see in the world, and that's living positively with love and light. And that's who I am.
Thank you so much. And
Welcome.
David Ben Moshe. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me as well. So my name is David Ben Moshe. I'm currently in Beersheba, Israel, the greatest city in Israel. I've been in Israel for about 5 years now, and the short story of mine is I found Judaism in federal prison, did the Orthodox conversion when I came out, changed my life, and now live in Israel with my wife and our 2 wonderful kids.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And Dmitry Shupatinsky.
Hello, thank you for having me on the panel. I'm Dmitry Shupatinsky. I'm an IDF veteran. I'm a junior research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy and a freelancer for Jewish News Syndicate. I live in Hadera, Israel, although right now I'm in Philadelphia.
Thank you. And Shakina Lark.
Hi, I'm Shakina Larks. I am a Black Jewish content creator. I converted to Judaism in 2018 and have been working in the diversity, equity, inclusion space within the Jewish community, providing education, building curriculum, and speaking about my own experience.
Welcome, thank you. Tyler Samuels.
Hi, I'm Tyler Samuels. I am creator of Blunt Black Jew. I am a trained historian. I live in Toronto, Canada, and it's a pleasure to be here. So.
Thank you. And Noah.
Hi, my name is Noah, and I actually made Aliyah from the United States to Israel, to Givat Olga, following in the footsteps of my older brother, my inspiration. And I currently work as an education and outreach manager in the Jerusalem office for Stand With Us. I'm also a musician by the name of Westside Gravy, where I like to incorporate a lot of important things about my upbringing, my Black Jewish and Soviet Jewish heritage into my music.
Thank you. Noah, we can't see you. I don't know if your camera is off or if it's it might be frozen. It may take a minute to link back. And I'm not sure if Yirmiyahu is able to join us yet. If he's in?
Hello. Thank you for having me. My name is Yirmiyahu. I'm an activist, educator, and content creator. I make most of my content about diverse Jewish experiences, telling my story as a Caribbean Jew of color, and also in trying to bridge between narratives. A lot of what I do on a regular basis is conflict resolution based. But here in the state of Israel, between the Arab community and the Jewish community, but also quite actively going back to the United States and dealing with issues concerning racial justice and the experience of Jews of color in the Americas.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Again, this is, we usually have much smaller panels, but I wanted as many voices as possible, especially everyone here who has so many important thoughts on the topic we're going to discuss today. So honestly, I just want to jump right in and pose the question. So we've seen over the past couple of years, there's an increase in certain conversations about the tensions between Black American and American Jewish communities. Specifically, we've seen that kind of devolve into maybe some anti-Blackness within the American Jewish community and anti-Israel, anti-Jewish ideas and thoughts in the Black American community. Before we get into that part, I want to ask what you guys think about, because I've noticed that a lot of the conversations that are being had on these tensions aren't involving Black Jews. So I'm wondering, do you think that this is an oversight? Do you think that it's, or do you think it's due to something else? And Haya, if you don't mind, let's start with you.
Wow, that's such a great question. I think, wow, let me take a breather, because I always try to just really put my words out in a way that are taken in by everyone. I believe that in the community that in the American Jewish community we come from, it's like being Black is one thing and being Jewish is one thing. So when we have a conversation where we're talking about Black and Jewish, it's really hard to bring those two together, even though we have those people in our community. So I think some of it is a fair enough, we overlooked it, but some of it is actually people actually talking over what they know exists in the community. And this is my personal opinion. I think I'm going to always give someone the benefit of the doubt, but I think it's unintentionally intentional.
Anyone else have any thoughts about that?
So I personally don't think it's an oversight, but to me it seems more like a lack of investment on the front end, where once we have these issues, we have not spent enough time investing in the Black Jewish voices, helping them educate and grow and become leaders in the community so that they're in the right places to make the right statements when these things happen. To me, it's a little bit more like when there's an incident, like today, Kanye tweeted this, let's see what the Black community has to say. So they asked like the one Black guy in the room, instead of thinking like, oh, like 5 years ago, we need to invest on the Black voices, get their opinions, help them grow with the community. And those are the voices we really want to be hearing and platforming.
So I know Noah and Yirmiyahu, you guys have spoken, and Chaya, you did too. I think was it I-24? There were a couple of different channels that reached out to you to speak about this issue, specifically after Kanye West's tweet and statement, multiple statements, and after the Kyrie Irving's retweet. What do you think?
So I think that, also part of my job is speaking out whenever anti-Semitism occurs across the platform. But I think it's very interesting to see what the conversation was like here in Israel. Definitely there wasn't that much perception or understanding of this history of Kanye West and his controversial statements in the past, which for me started with him disrespecting Harriet Tubman and all the other Black women he's disrespected throughout his career. Which, regardless of the anti-Semitism that occurred later on, as a Black man, I'm not going to support that. And I think it was important to see that even people in Israel were reaching out to Black Jews to comment on this, because people here were able to see that that's an important voice when talking about this specific issue. And I hope that a lot of different American organizations and media takes initiative to kind of follow that lead.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that, and this is also answering your first question as well to an extent, I think we have an a priori problem in the perspective in which we tell Jewish history. Often in Jewish spaces, we assume that the center of the Jewish world is Sephardic and Ashkenazic, and specifically Sephardic and Ashkenazic experiences which present as white, that were primarily based in the West, in European civilization, and then European civilization in the New World. And as a result of that, other communities exist on the periphery of the Jewish world. And so, although we know for a fact historically that Jews of color, enslaved, free, were a reality in the beginning of Jewish communities in the Americas, whether Caribbean, Latin America, or what became the United States, And despite the fact that these communities existed, it's often presented as if this was just a peripheral issue and the main story of the Jewish experience is something else. And that is basically the problem which we deal with on a regular basis. And this gets combined with the efforts of anti-Semites to take advantage of that. Because often when they see the stereotypical face of Jewishness, of Judaism, presenting in a way which they see as representing the white establishment, any type of friction between people of color, whether it's people of color generally or certain marginal groups within the Black community, then they're able to use this fact that we're erased from these types of spaces and to say you're either Jewish or you're Black. And certainly, this room is testimony to the fact that that is not the case.
Thank you. Shakina, I think you said you wanted to indicate you want to say
Yeah.
something, please.
What I often say is that where there is anti-Blackness, there's often anti-Semitism. And I think that when we look at both Black and Jewish communities, whether that is internalized or, or, part of that person's overall understanding of the world, it happens. And I think that a lot of this conversation has been opportunistic. And I don't think that that is an oversight. I think that because of the bias and because of the biases that each community hold about each other because of disinformation and lack of access to information from experience, that we often exaggerate the similarities and the differences between these two groups of people. And because there is no Genesis story for the African American community that isn't rooted in trauma, I think that people are trying to latch onto to any and every story that feels familiar. And I think that that's something that we don't discuss, is the familiarity that the Black community shares with the Jewish community. I think that we get caught in this battle to expose each other. And that exposure is often rooted in disinformation and lack of access to information about people's lived experiences.
Thank you. So thinking about that and what all of you touched on, there's this question of ignorance, and not ignorance in a malevolent way, but ignorance in the rooted in actually not knowing and not understanding. So is that a failure of Jewish education? Dimitri, I know you've spoken about this before and written about it a lot, about Jewish education, Jews across the diaspora and in the land actually knowing the history of the people and peoplehood. Do you think it's a failure of Jewish education to include these histories and stories of the diversity of the Jewish people?
Yes, I do. I think that that's the biggest problem for the Jewish community in the United States, not understanding the diversity of Israel, and also not, quite frankly, understanding the depth of history of Black experience in the United States. And also, I think that has been seen with the response to, for example, Kyrie Irving and every other anti-Jewish statement or hate crime that we've seen. The automatic response is to bring somebody to a Holocaust museum. And while there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, that doesn't define what it means to be Jewish. Similarly, we've seen these sort of interactions on other panels or discussions about Black-Jewish relations, and automatically we only talk about the civil rights era, not anything before that, not anything after. As well as if you look at discussions on Black Jews, and I'm thinking now about Ethiopian Jewry in particular, at least in US spaces, but also in other places as well, the history of Ethiopian Jews starts with them moving to Israel. It doesn't start with the thousands of years of Ethiopian Jewish heritage. It doesn't start with the situation nowadays, with few exceptions. We need to have more of a open and honest conversation, and I think that begins with having more panels like this, but also rich scholarship that teaches our youth the diversity of the Jewish experience, and also that engages with other people to learn from them about their diverse experiences and histories, and also to present ourselves that way, not just based off of shallow generalizations like we've seen from too much of the traditional Jewish leadership.
Thank you. Speaking of rich scholarship, Tyler Samuels, you're a historian, a professional historian. How do we fix it?
It's a lot. I don't really have the answer to how to fix it completely, but I would say the first step is actually talking about these histories. I don't know how many times I write something I post on Instagram, and then under the comments, oh, I didn't know about this form of Jewish history. Oh my God, that's so amazing. And I think that's a serious problem because using my own personal history, like I've yet to see any Sephardic organization, especially in the United States. I'm not American, but they take no interest in Sephardic history in the Caribbean, which is a rich history, which is how the Jewish community in the States got started, how it kind of got started in Canada, especially from Sephardic Jews. And in particular, in the United States, Sephardic Jews from the Caribbean helped start that community because in New York, the main Sephardic synagogue had connections to the Jamaican synagogue and vice versa. They traded rabbis and religious leadership constantly back and forth to each community. And when there's a lack or no care for any sort of scholarship or attempt to engage a community in these places that still exist, it does tremendous harm to Jewish education, because then you'll have Jews growing up in diaspora saying, oh, I didn't know these people were Jewish. I didn't know there was this community or that community. It just overall spreads ignorance. And so what has to happen is, first, there has to be a lot of scholarship. Jewish organizations can provide the funds for this. There really needs to be a reassessment of how overall Jewish education in the diaspora. What are Hebrew day schools teaching young Jews about their history? Are they teaching it a diverse Jewish history, or are they just teaching it to small events in our long chain of history? Is it only focusing on the horrible things happening to us, or is it focusing over everything? And that's another issue that Jewish education has. So there's a lot of areas that need to be improved, and hopefully it starts soon. So
I appreciate that. So I look at because I work in DEI spaces and in educational spaces. It's been fascinating to me how many institutions that are involved in Jewish education don't actually focus on Jewish diversity. They focus on diversity in an American-centric sense, which obviously doesn't apply well to the Jewish people as a nation of people. And that being said, I want to actually come back to this point in a minute, because I want to discuss a little bit the difference between, when I'm saying America, I mean Canada and the US. So I want to discuss the difference between America, Canada, the United States of America, and Canada, which is also in North America, and Israel, as far as color-based racial categories. But I'm going to hold off on that for a second. I want to talk a little bit about, or ask you a little bit about, the conflicted feelings being a Black Jew when there are certain instances where movements for Black Americans embrace anti-Jewish or anti-Israel rhetoric. And then some members in the Jewish community use that rhetoric to paint all Black people as anti-Semitic. How do you navigate that, if that's been your experience? Again, this has been something that I've seen, but if that's been in your experience, how do you navigate that? Haya? I'm sorry, go ahead, Tyler.
I'm thinking about it, but anyone could jump in, really. I'm trying to think about it, because it has happened to me often, various times, where people will write, well, look at these Black people. We did so much for them during the civil rights movement, and now look what they're doing. They're supporting this anti-Semite. And it's hard to navigate because on the one hand, if you say anything, this is from my own personal experience, if you say anything, you're accused of anti-Semitism. If you don't say anything, you're accused of being anti-Black. Like there's no nuance. There's no saying this is wrong. Like anti-Semitism is wrong. We need to speak out about it. But how you're phrasing it, it's like anti-Semitism has a different racial flavor. Black anti-Semitism, Asian anti-Semitism, when in reality it's just anti-Semitism, and these people are using it as a way to just be racist. They don't care to actually solve these issues, solve the tensions, solve whatever is going on within Black communities. They'd rather just label all Black people as this monolith of supporting anti-Semitic Black leaders. And it's increasingly hard to try and have dialogue or conversation to break it down and to point out, like, this is only some Black people, just like there are only some Jewish people who spew anti-Black racism. And there needs to be a lot of nuance to this conversation. So it's hard trying to dissect both sides when you belong to both identities, because you're always being pulled from one side to another about why aren't you defending us? How come you're defending them? Sort of behavior.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced people asking that of me. And I feel like I'm like that's one of those conversations that's just absurd in my opinion. It's like there's a moment in which people are so hyper reliant on their bias, they're not able to unpack their anti-Black bias, that they're not able to unpack that this person is just uneducated about the situation, and that in the context of the United States, the American education system isn't teaching people these things. So it's just like, how do you expect people who have no access to learn or understand about 2% of the population to fully understand the intricacies of the American Jewish experience? You can't, especially if you're not making any effort to engage with that community. Like, we'll go back to the civil rights movement, but what have we done to engage the Black community in the last almost 60 years? Nothing. Almost nothing. And as somebody who is an educator a youth educator in Jewish spaces, who is actively trying to help teens learn more about Jewish peoplehood and navigate these tougher questions of what the history of our people means, what the context of our peoplehood means within the grand scheme of the history of the United States and all of the racialism that exists within the United States. I think that one of the most recent examples of that was when people were asking me quite a bit about Whoopi Goldberg, especially after she made this statement a second time. And there was this need for them for me to condemn her. And it's just like, I can't really condemn ignorance, like, obviously this is something that she believes, but that comes out of a place of not having been educated on the history and not having access to the information, and the community that's responsible for engaging in that information themselves will not engage in the information themselves. So if we are not willing to educate ourselves about our history, how can we expect other communities to walk on that journey or toe that line if we don't understand who we are?
Yeah, I resonate with that very deeply. I think that in the presence of a vacuum of knowledge, of massive amounts of ignorance, people rely on character. So it's very easy, for example, for an outsider looking in on Israeli society to look at the Mizrahi experience and to caricature it and say everybody, like Mizrahi, Jews in Israel, that is Ben Gvir and Kahanism, or al-Yaderi and Shas, for those who are familiar with Israeli politics. And anybody who's intimately aware, not only with the Mizrahi experience in Israel, also knows the history, would say, no, that's not true at all. And within that context, we have to understand how Kahanism and Shas developed and what answers they gave to certain parts of the population. Likewise, those of us with the insider knowledge of what's happening in Black America, we know what is going on behind the headlines when the movement for Black Lives says something which is anti-Zionist, which is what I believe that Brandy was referring to in the question. Or when the Nation of Islam, increases its views by 10% or something. The problem is that people looking outside, and unfortunately that's the majority of the Jewish community, when they look in and they see these things happening, it's very easy to just go to the caricature instead of asking the questions for people within the Jewish community that actually have the insider knowledge. So what we all need to do, whether we're on one side of the aisle or the other, standing in the intersection, is we need to humble ourselves and ask questions, because we're at this point with so much confusion. The Jewish community in America is confronting a serious identity crisis. Likewise, other communities in the United States are dealing with a major identity crisis. And the only way that I think we can fix it is by humbling ourselves, asking questions, be willing to teach, and also willing to learn.
So I hear you, and I agree with what you're saying, but I don't see that happening. I still see a resistance. And I have concluded, maybe, and I could be wrong, I'm human and open to being wrong, but it seems that only people with a very specific ideological slant get invited to the table to have the conversation and to be the representative of whichever community. And so I wonder, okay, there's ignorance, we have to tackle it. We have to do better at educating. I think there's an instance, at least in the United States, of both Black Americans and American Jewish communities not being well educated on our own histories and who we are as a people. And I think that is fueling a lot of the ignorance. But how to combat that when, okay, if I don't agree, step by step in lockstep with a specific ideology, I'm not invited to the conversation. And I wonder how do we get through that obstacle?
I think we're doing that right now. I think the way we get around that is building out new platforms. Like if a certain organization has an ideological bent and will only invite people who agree with them to speak on their behalf, then you can make your own live stream. You can have your own Twitter feed, like getting the knowledge out there and having the discussions, even though you're not invited to the table, gives you the opportunity to make new tables. And when so many people are so unhappy with the representation, like as a Black man and a Jew, like no one speaks for me as a Black man, no one speaks for me as a Jew. And most of the organizations that are supposed to be doing something like that, I feel like are not doing a great job of anything but promoting their own organization and picking one side of a culture debate, which is kind of taking over the entire world. Instead, we need to just have real conversations about real problems, discuss them, and have solutions, and the people will come to where the good information is.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think that build it and they will come is an awesome philosophy. I also feel like I've experienced the not being invited because people aren't ready for that conversation. There's a specific kind of conversation they're trying to have, and I think that conversation is often rooted in exposure. They're being intentionally inflammatory and provocative, and they're trying to get clicks and views. They're not really trying to have a conversation. They're not really trying to unpack any of this information. Like I had a friend of mine's photo was circulating in this conversation on whether Black Hebrew Israelites will convert to Judaism at some point. And this conversation was on this rabbi's podcast. And this man, my friend, is a pretty well-known Black Orthodox Jewish rabbi who was born Orthodox. So to have his image misrepresented for this conversation really showed to me that they don't care. Like they're not trying to have that conversation. They don't care about the conversation. And that's very gutting that people don't care. And I think that the more that we have these forums and we have these discussions and we make our voices heard, the more the information will get out there. And the more people's ideas will be challenged. I really don't think that people are willing in the Jewish community to challenge the anti-Black biases that they hold in order to be able to have some more of those meaningful conversations where we are arriving at a table where we can share a feast.
I'm so glad you said that. Can I just jump in really quickly?
Please.
I've been so quiet because I'm so used to like tap, tap, tap. I'm like, I really wanted to hear everybody speak, but I totally agree with her. Many times I really, really believe, especially when we're talking about American Judaism, we have built an identity. For me, this is how I speak on my social media, so this is not a surprise. I was with the Tel Aviv Institute a year and a half ago in New York with Yirmiyahu, and I know also Noah's part of that. And I learned a lot about what we choose to highlight. We can't say, oh, we want to talk about this Black issue, but we don't want to include Black Jews. And why does including Black Jews sometimes seem hard is because that hits at the identity of who we are as Jews. Do you guys hear what I'm saying? And so we are absolutely not saying, like, well, yeah, I want to hear from her, but you know what? I'd rather tell my story of what I think she's going to say. And you can't speak for, like, I'm also with David Ben Moshe, like, no, I can't speak for all Black people. I can't speak for Black Jews. So, like, if you come and ask me about Whoopi, like, I can just kind of give you a little bit of nuance as a woman living in the Black community of what she could mean, but I don't speak for her. And the Black Hebrew Israelite thing is like, people like, the amount of times that people have come on because I live in Israel and I have a scope and a range, and I can see it from, it's not just Black or white, it's a mixture of everything. It's like a taco salad. And I see that and I know that. And so I'm trying to talk it through, and people are like, she's a Black Hebrew Israelite. And I was like, it's like the new name calling thing as a way to take away from your legitimacy in the community. And you're like, no, I'm not. If someone is, I'm not taking away from that, but I'm saying I'm not. However, I'm just telling you that I can look at the situation and see it instead of, because if you're not Black, how do you understand? If you haven't lived that life, how can you have that nuance? Not saying you can't speak on it. I'm just saying, let someone that has lived that life and can give a little bit more nuance have the floor. And that's why I think this is so important. And I'm really grateful because it is putting that nuance. And if we're here talking and someone doesn't want to take that, Brandy, it's because they don't want to take that. If someone, you can talk blue like this, and if someone says, no, which we've seen over and over again, it's because they don't want to take it, because it also, takes away from their identity. And it shouldn't, because the Jewish people, we're a multitude. It's just so many ways to do this. So it doesn't have to mean just because I'm bringing myself to the table that you lose who you are at the table. If that makes sense.
And I think I would build on that and say, don't just get like one person who's had that lived experience, get a few people who've had that lived experience and have come to different outcomes based on their own individual circumstances, and get that conversation going. And that's how people who didn't live through it can see the nuance and start to understand what's going on. Like, you can't just go find one Black person, be like, oh, this is what's like to be Black in America. Like, go talk to 10, 100, and you get all of those together. You try to understand how they're like directly conflicting each other, how this one says this one had the same experience, believes in this. And that's how we get the nuanced conversations that really are educational and get people to see what life is really like, which is almost never a simple narrative.
I love that. And there are 8 of us here with 8 different perspectives, which is kind of the point. So yeah. Noah, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I want to jump in and talk a little bit about also the way that we can actually change. It has to do with the way that we're gonna look at our own communities and people within our own community. So I'll tell like a quick personal story about something that I dealt with recently. So there was a case where someone did something anti-Semitic, not a Black person, but someone who felt like sort of postured themselves as an ally to BIPOC or whatever, however they wanted to say it. They came out, they said something anti-Semitic. I called it out, and I had people criticizing me, a Black person criticizing me for calling out an anti-Semite who wasn't even Black, trying to make it reflect as if I was somehow anti-Black for calling out this other person who was anti-Semitic, despite the fact we were the only 2 Black people here. And I think what that also stems from is sometimes within our own communities, we don't look at people who are seen as non-normative for the sense of being the fact that I'm Black and I'm also Jewish. So that person wasn't actually seeing the fact that they're talking to a fellow Black person, that me as a Black person was calling out this anti-Semite. What they saw was, oh, I'm a puppet of the Jews to call out this other person of color who's an ally to BIPOC or whatever, and therefore diminish my own identity. And I think that that's something that happens repeatedly because there's a conscious effort to view people, despite the fact that, yes, we have a lot of different opinions here, but also I think for the most part, our opinions when it comes to condemning anti-Semitism and racism are relatively mainstream when it comes to regular type of people. But there's this conscious effort to try and diminish our voices when we talk about it and make it seem as if we're non-normative and not part of that larger community. To the case where I had a Black person taking the side of a non-Black person, against me. And I think that that's the issue that you see repeatedly, that someone who wants to be more allied with the cause that's not even part of their culture because they're putting a modern ideology over their roots results in them putting that ahead of their brethren. And I think that that's an issue we need to explore what does it mean to have that brotherhood and sisterhood within our communities.
I think that's a common thing that we've see and encounter a lot more because there are movements of supposed intersectional solidarity that foment exactly what the experience that you had, where there's a lot of performativeness going on that I think is actually fueling a lot of the bigotry that we see. I want to ask you, those of you who live in Israel, and those of us who have traveled there and spent time there, what is the main difference you've seen and how you are perceived as a Jewish person who's also Black?
I'm going to speak on that. First of all, I'm going to say, honey, one thing I love about living in Israel is when something pops off, I-24 calls the people that they think have the most knowledge. That's what I love about, living in Israel. They're like, let's call the people. Second of all, people not saying that they don't know I'm Black, but my Jewishness definitely comes first. They see me as a person. I'm seen as a person, not like, oh, listen, I have a great Jewish community back in the U.S. I must say I have such great people. But when I got to Israel, I just saw I really the first time that I said, oh, I'm Jewish, and I walked into a Beit Knesset and people were like, they were like, it was not a big deal. Okay, anytime I've ever been asked if I'm Jewish in Israel is by an American. In Israel, I was speaking Hebrew on the bus and someone said, oh, it's so cute you speak Hebrew. Where are you from? Africa. Lost Africa, California, okay? Not a bad thing, okay? Not a bad thing. But it was just, they couldn't imagine something didn't click. I don't have those issues in Israel. Not saying that people don't have their own prejudices and biases. That's not what I'm saying. I'm never going to say that. However, coming to it's like second nature, I'm like, oh, I did a GU, or I don't tell a lot of people I did a GU or a conversion. And people are like, you did? They're like, oh, there's African Jews. I'm like, of course, because I hang out with African Jews, Igbo Jews, but it's just a different clique of everything. Jews are an endless possibility here. You can be any type of Jew. It's an endless possibility. It's like a Jew buffet. And I love it. I love it. I love that for us.
So that is interesting to me because I actually get asked a fair amount if I'm Jewish. And it's almost always in the grocery store.
Really?
Who's clearly, yeah, all the time I get asked.
See those two brown sugar opinions? See?
Yeah.
Really?
And one of the things I notice about is it's always someone who's very clearly non-religious. Religious people never ask if I'm Jewish. It probably helps I wear a kippah and I keep my tzitzits out. So but I think when I'm in the grocery store, someone who's non-religious will see the kippah and the tzitzit and be curious. It's the first question that pops into their mind is, are you Jewish? And I'm always nice about it. I always think that sometimes I should be like, nah, I just wear keep on titi because I like the way they look, and Israel is just where I happen to end up. But I get it all the time.
I want to hear from everybody here, but I'm jumping in for a minute anyway. So the first time I visited Israel was in 2020 during the pandemic. I was visiting Dimitri, my oldest son, while he was still serving in the IDF, and I was pleasantly surprised that everybody came up to me speaking in Hebrew, which I don't speak a lick of Hebrew, like, because the assumption wasn't that I'm not Jewish. The assumption was, of course I am. So and in the United States, the questioning, how are you Jewish? 100%, 99% of the time comes from people that are politically liberal for me. So in conservative spaces, religiously observant spaces, I've never been asked that question. It just doesn't happen. Anyway, sorry. So continue. I want to hear about everyone else's experiences too.
So mine is a little bit, I would say it's somewhere in between what David and Chaya expressed. And I think that just as we mentioned before, like, we're not a monolith. You know, Tyler and I are both Caribbean Jews, but we both look very different. And we all, as a result of that, and many other factors, we have very different experiences, both historically and personally. And because of my appearance, and probably Noah can identify with this, sometimes people confuse us in terms of how we look. You know, I often get identified as Yemenite or Bedouin, and these are pretty typical because these are also populations that have very strong roots and connections to Africa, as a result of being very mixed. And I think that part of the reason why I've also had the experience of when people find out that I'm not one of those populations, they're asking, oh, how are you Jewish? Is maybe it could be because I'm male. There's like an assumption that that a man who is, you know, standing out and a little bit different in the way that he looks, in the background, the way that he talks, the place that he comes from, that perhaps that person needs to be checked a little bit more to see how much they're a threat or not a threat. Mm-hmm. And I think because, you know, my appearance overlaps with a population in Israeli society, which is more on the margins, specifically the Bedouin population, which is mixed African and Arab. It's something which, you know, overlaps a little bit with the type of treatment I would receive in the United States, in the sense that, like, I'm very used to in Israel getting stopped by the cops, even though I was a cop myself and still serve in the reserves as a police officer. And also being, you know, checked whenever I go to the train, whenever I go to a public place, and there's security. Like, that happens to me in Israel all the time. And I think it's also something that happens a lot to Ethiopian Israelis, as in addition to Yemenite Israelis and Indian Israelis. And that's because there is an aspect of colorism, both that comes to Israel through Hollywood, through American media that Israelis consume in abundance. But also very old, you know, stigmas about color that come from the region. You know, Arab countries are not lacking in any way, shape, or form of anti-Black racism. And as a result, it also exists in Israel to a lesser extent. But I think in general, and this is where I very much agree with Chaya, once the questioning or the look of of concern passes, and I'm able to speak to somebody in Israel, everybody wants to talk to you. It's not like Israel or America where everybody's kind of alone in their own world. It's like everybody wants to get in your business. Once you actually start a conversation, it becomes very human, very family oriented very quickly. And once that happens, there's this ethos that binds everyone. And that's this collective Israeli ethos, which maybe we can talk about more. So for that, I feel in general much safer as a Jew of color in Israel, even if our specific identity is still marginal within Israeli society.
Thank you.
I visited Israel for the first time when I went on Birthright. And I think one of the I would say, like, it was different for me because a lot of times people, like when I was at the Dead Sea, there was a group of people who I told I was Black and I was American, and they argued with me about it. They're like, no, you're not. And it's just like, how do you know that? Like, how can you tell me what I am? I know what I am, right? And when I was in SPOT, I went into, well, one of the jewelry stores there, and I saw this mezuzah necklace, and I was like, this is what I came to Israel to get, and I'm super excited about it. And the man immediately says, "You can't buy it." And I was like, "Why not?" And he's like, "Do you know what it is?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do." He's like, "I don't know. How do I know you know what it is?" Or I don't remember exactly what he said, but he was like very much like, "No, I don't think you understand. Like, this is a ritual item," and trying to explain to me. And so I just start saying the Shema, and he immediately starts apologizing to me and trying to make it right. And like I would say, like, that was the difference around my Jewish identity. My Jewish identity wasn't questioned. It was always my blackness being questioned. And like I felt like I belonged there and simultaneously didn't, because people would either assume that I was Israeli, but like African, or they would assume that I wasn't there. My Jewishness was never the question. It was just always a question of whether I was black or not. I think that there's a little bit more, I might look a little bit more ambiguous in Israel than I do in the United States. But like to contrast that experience in the United States, again, like for me, like Israelis in the United States never question my Jewishness. They are asking questions about my blackness. And for me in American Jewish spaces, and I mean, like because of the work I do, I'm often in trans-denominational spaces. So I work with the most liberal of Jewish approaches to the most conservative of Jewish approaches. And, while I'm Masorti, I converted conservative, like when I go into Orthodox spaces, like I'm good enough to work there, but I don't belong in their community. And I've been told that. So it's just like, I have been told by rabbis that you will never be welcome in this community, but you trust me to take care of your children, which is ironic, And then, in liberal Jewish spaces, people are always asking me if I'm Jewish, what I'm doing. They assume I'm the help often. But like that kind of is my experience in the American Jewish community, unless I am showing up with some authority. Like if I'm showing up as an educator, it's different. But then there's also been times where I show up as an educator and people are asking me to prove who I am. So like I think that that's happened substantially less in COVID time, given that I'm doing most of this work online now. But when I was doing it in person, it was it was always a challenge of people not believing what I said about myself.
Dimitri, what about you? What's been your experience?
I don't get questioned as much about my Judaism based on looks as I do my name. I don't know if a lot of people in the audience know this, but there's the stigma that most of the Soviet immigrants to Israel are not Jewish according to halakha. There are a significant chunk where that's the case, but if I remember correctly, not the majority. So I've been more questioned at the times when I have been questioned based off of having a very obvious Russian name. On the other hand, I don't really get questioned based off of how I look on if I'm Jewish or not. There are a number of people that ask, for example, where I'm from. They're kind of surprised I'm American despite my accent. I've been asked if I'm from Brazil or from Azerbaijan. One woman asked me one time if I'm Chinese. So I have gotten those kind of questions. I do feel that, yes, there are elements of, colorism or bigotry and things like that in Israel, as there is in every country. But for me, being a Black Jew, I feel much safer in day-to-day life and less stressed and anxious existing both as a Black Jew, where I can walk into a synagogue and not be looked at strangely or asked certain questions, but also just as a Black man in general. In my experience, I'm not worried about if it's raining, putting on a hood or things like that. In the same way that I am right now, as I mentioned, I'm in Philadelphia. I'm not worried about the same kind of things there. as I am in the United States.
Noah?
Yeah, I think to jump in, my experience here in Israel, first and foremost, I don't really get questioned off the bat. In the United States, I would get questioned off the bat all the time. How are you Jewish? In Israel, especially where I live in Givat Olga, there's a very diverse set of people who live there, who've made Aliyah over the years, either as refugees or immigrants, whether it's from North Africa to East Africa, Ethiopia, to the Caucasus, to Yemen. So like there's already been a lot of Jews who look different, who live there and live amongst each other. So I go to Beit Knesset, it's an Orthodox synagogue, it's a Libyan synagogue. I go there because it's the one that was in my neighborhood, an older one, and I like it. And I've never got a single question about it, not once. There have been times in Israel where Americans have asked me, oh, how are you Jewish? That's the first thing that comes to their mind. Israelis sometimes will ask questions to me just because they're curious. That's what I've gotten. Again, more so, they're curious, why does a brown person like you have such a Russian last name and roll your R like that? Either you must speak Russian or speak Spanish. And then I tell them about my identity, and 9 times out of 10, my own personal experience has been people say, wow, that's interesting. You know, I actually knew someone from the army who was Russian and Black, whether it's Black Ethiopian or Black from another place in the African diaspora and Jewish. And usually that's the end of the conversation. Maybe they'll, like, it's cool, it's interesting. And then they'll say, oh, like, tell your whole family, come home to Israel. And that's been my own personal experience. It's also been funny to see how the concept of being Black in Israel has been different throughout history. So one of my first times when I was on, not when I was on Taglit actually, when I was on a different Israel trip, Hasbara Fellowships in the winter of 2018, walked into a hotel in Netanya, and the man working the desk was Moroccan. And I don't remember if you heard that I just had a little weird accent. He's asking where I was from when I was speaking Hebrew. And I told him I'm American. He's like, what? No way. And I told him that I'm, he asked like, from where? And I explained to him that like I'm Black and Russian. And he's like, oh, you're Black? Like, same. Because the concept for him of being, especially his generation, having come from North Africa, being Moroccan, in Israeli context, he identified as Black. And I, you know, kind of talked to him a little bit and was like, and he's like, oh, I'm also Black. Are you Moroccan? And I told him, no, like, I'm African American. He's like, oh, I'm also African. I'm Moroccan. Morocco's in Africa. And I was like, I'm like West African American. He's like, oh, you know, Morocco's on the western side of North Africa. I was like, all right, like, you know, but that's something that I much rather appreciate and be able to feel that sense of brotherhood of someone who's trying to build that connection with you, versus what I've sort of dealt with in certain cases in the United States. But I mean, in the US, I've also had a lot of positive experience. I think more in the US, it's 50-50. So I've had a lot of positive experiences, like at my university, GW Hillel, I was never questioned about my identity, but it had happened enough beforehand that any time in the US when I walked into a space, I kind of was preparing myself to answer these questions. And I just don't get that feeling in Israel, just based on my own lived experience. And that also probably has a lot to do with where I live and the sort of circles, including religious observance, with people who I interact with.
I would just really quick, Noah, I really want to back you up on that because I made Aliyah to Hadera, and absolutely that's probably why we have the same experience. Hadera is like a crazy mix, and that's where I was, and I just didn't have those issues. Once again, I want to reiterate that I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm just speaking from my particular experience. And also, David and Yirmiyahu, the men, I think that is true. The men just get a different vibe than the women. But Noah, yes, you and I both know that Hadera is a little bit more diverse. So that's probably why also we have a little bit more positive experiences as well.
And I think
another interesting thing with,
oh my,
yeah, I was just going to say that with Yirmiyahu, it's interesting that like I never get stopped by the police anywhere or extra searches. They just see me and they hear my American accent and they wave me right through. It's like night and day from America where I get stopped everywhere. Like in Israel, everyone's like, oh, you're cool. They just want to talk to me about like American culture.
Yeah, so I don't have the benefit of like an American accent when I speak Hebrew. So people will hear me speak Hebrew and they hear like mostly an Israeli accent, but they hear there's something a little bit off. And for them, off like a red light for, okay, is this person an Arabic speaker who's speaking Hebrew right now? And in some contexts, is this person Ethiopian? Like there's a few different contexts, and I think this there's so many details about this, but I think just to reinforce the point that Noah was just making, blackness in the context of Israel and Israeli identity is very different to blackness in the context of American identity. And there are points in which they intersect, mostly because of the immigration of people like us to Israel, but also because of Hollywood. But in general, there's a different trajectory. And blackness in Israel was first defined by the Aliyah of Jews from India, of Jews from Cochin that identified as black, and Jews from Bnei Israel that were identified by the society as black, and then Ethiopian Jews. And so automatically, these populations were connected to the stereotypes that the society got from Hollywood to black folks in America. The difference being is that because Americans are seen as being, more cultured and more Western, the negative aspects of blackness that we're familiar with in America don't usually translate to African American Caribbean Jews in Israel. Yet the Ethiopian population deals with probably the brunt of anti-black racism in Israeli society today, but not exclusively.
That piece that is fascinating to so many people who aren't actually aware of it. But it makes me question then, if in the United States our main problem is that we're using American-centric definitions and stereotypes and caricatures of what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be Black to our detriment, when the real center of Jewishness is Israel. So is the problem that we're not, is where we're centering what it means to be Jewish is off and is fueling a lot of these tensions and issues where we need to maybe recenter it?
If I can start on that, I think that is an enormous problem with Jewish education in the United States, and also, quite frankly, even with movements like Black Lives Matter. And I think that it's so ironic because you have many of these people who are progressive and who want to see and understand the world through a non-Western centric lens, and yet they're doing exactly this. And so I think a lot of the American Jewish community has ignored the history of certain Jewish populations, or even Israel's current demographic makeup, because they have not yet adjusted to the fact that, as historically was and as it should be, Israel is once again the center of Jewish civilization, and the majority of the biggest Jewish population in the world is there and no longer in the US. So I think that there is this both ignorance of that fact among some, and also for some, they're not really comfortable with it and want to, I guess, kind of hide that fact in order to continue with their own narratives. Regarding movements like Black Lives Matter or other similar movements and organizations, there's, again, this sort of ignorance about what it means to be Black in other contexts and in other countries. So there's this pushing of a certain idea of anti-racism to countries like France or the United Kingdom or Australia that have very different histories of Black people there and of racism in general in those countries than the history of racism and Black people in the United States. You just can't really understand the history of people through a generalized American-centric or even more broadly Western-centric lens and say that the issues facing Black people or racism in general are exactly the same and intersectional. It's just not historically accurate.
Well, thank you.
I'd agree that it's not entirely historically accurate. I also think that we need to be careful to not overlay the social or racial domestic politics of any country onto another country. Like, even the politics of the United States and Canada, as similar as they are different. So when we look at the socialization and racialization of people in different countries, I think that it's important to notice that we can draw similarities, but also heavily note the differences. And Jews living in the United States and Jews living in Israel are contending with different questions and issues and histories regarding race, especially regarding Blackness. And I don't think that they're comparable. I don't think that we can. I do think that Jews as a whole, globally speaking, are an excellent case study for the nuances and the inaccuracies of racialization. And because there are Jews who live all over the world, and majority of the Jewish global population does not live in Israel, we have to contend with the fact that Jews are having numerously different experiences depending on where in the world they are. And that impacts the way that they are practicing Judaism, that impacts the way that they are interpreting Torah, that impacts the way that they are developing peoplehood where they live. And, like, I don't think that it is helpful to compare the racial politics of Israel to the racial politics of the United States, because we're contending with very incredibly different history, ancient histories versus modern histories. It's not really possible to compare.
I kind of want to push back just a little bit on that point. To the most part, I agree. I mean, the vast majority of what you just said, I vehemently agree. But I think that was my position. I would say up until a couple of years ago. But unfortunately for me, it was shattered with the Ethiopian protests and, as some would probably accurately describe, riots from 2015 to 2009. And I remember I was a squad commander in the border police during that time period. I was watching how the society and how people in my family were responding to these issues, and it was like I was watching the Americanization of Israeli ethnic politics before my eyes. And this is just the reality of social media today, that what was maybe a unique and separate phenomenon, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, now it very quickly bleeds off into other spheres. And I think, while we need to be conscious of the differences historically, and how they manifest in people's consciousness and identity today in Israeli society, and how different that is from what's going on in America and our lived experiences as coming from America. At the same time, we have to recognize that a lot of people have adopted these identities very strongly, because the power of media is something which we're still figuring out how to contend with, particularly when media is this quick and so quickly consumed. And I think it does put us in a unique position. Those of us that are intimately familiar with the development of racialization in the Americas and how the Jewish community and the Black community there have contended with it, and the way that the Jewish community, the Israeli community, and the Black community in Israel have contended with racialization. I think the one point I want to make about this issue of racialization, the legacy of racialization, is that the Jewish world of the West, collectively, specifically in America, but also just the West in general, is reeling from the trauma of being racialized in Europe for centuries and the tragedy that created with the Holocaust. And as a result of that, many leaders of the Jewish world said what we need to do is de-racialize. We need to become racially neutral. Unfortunately, we know that in the Western context, and particularly the American context, becoming racially neutral is a dog whistle for whiteness. And as a result of that, we're seeing not only the erasure of voices of Jews of color and the experience of Jews of color in the United States, but also the way that global Jewry connects to Israel, connects to the Middle East, connects to the Levant as a part of this kind of collective peoplehood that's rooted to a specific homeland and a specific civilization. So I agree with the majority of what Shekhinah just said. I just think that we need to broaden the context in which we understand racialization and recognize that the American racial politics can no longer be said to be just or primarily located there, because America is the global empire. It influences things that happen everywhere.
Kind of building off that, to me, it seems like the problem is, again, this America global empire. Like, it's not that the Jews are taking the way America racializes, and that's a problem. It's that everyone in the entire world has decided that America is the best culturally, and so many people are trying to take things in America because things work better in America. But America is not perfect, has its problems. America is a great country, but I'm not sure why any country or society in the world would want to take the American racial system that's been developed and has been so broken for so long and harmed any people and take aspects of that and apply it to your own society just because we like American culture, we have American Instagram, therefore we should start using the same language and thinking about race the same way, even though we don't have this history, when really it's good you don't have the same history. Again, there's bad racial interactions, there's ethnic clashes that go back, to the beginning of time, but this idea that we should do things like America, especially when America does something poorly, just seems like a very silly way to advance your society in a positive way.
I agree, and I think you all bring up a good points that actually lead to more questions and we'll have time to cover. I just want to say this. I think that acknowledging, and maybe this is something that gets missed in a context outside of America, American-centric racial categories are color-based. The Jewish people are not. So those two things, that already builds its own tension. Jewish people live on every habitable continent on Earth. So look the way peoples in every continent live because of exile and enslavement and the rest of it, and such a long history of diaspora. So I think, obviously in the United States, we have color-based racial categories. That's a reality. That's what we deal with here. Those can't really be exported to the Jewish people as the people who predate color-based racial categories. But I want to get to some of the questions that are in the comments. There's a bunch of them, which are interesting. Won't be able to get to all of them. But someone asked whether the information issue is about lack of access or lack of will and interest to actually explore and learn instead of just accepting popular narratives. And this is when we were speaking earlier about lack of knowledge in American Jewish spaces about the diversity of the Jewish people.
It's definitely not lack of access. Like, we have the internet, you can find as much information as you're out there. What I think the question misses is it's not just lack of will and interest, it's also confusion from all the conflicting information that's out there, and trying to figure out what's true and what's not is a legitimately difficult thing to do, even for highly trained researchers, to figure out the truth from the lies. So I think it's more of that combined with some people lack of will and interest, but lack of information. It's all out there.
I actually think it's lack of. Sorry,
I think it's too much information. Like you said, it's too much going on. People can't decipher. They can't break it down. But I believe it's a mix. I think it's too much. People are lazy. Look, we're getting information about, Israel, IP, American stuff from 15-second TikToks. Nah, boom, boom, call me, dot, dot, ha. We literally have been dumbed down to 15-second TikToks about information about countries that we don't even study in American history. Okay, let's keep it real. So I think people are lazy. People are straight up lazy, and they're just trying to take what they can. And I think it's also people do not want to get into it. They just want to go do their thing. It's always been like this. Yalla, okay, we don't know. We have to be honest. I'm just saying, in social media, we're not honest. We're not honest. We don't want to tell the truth. We don't want to keep it real. We want to pretend like, oh yeah, everybody no, some people don't know, don't care, don't want to know, and that's okay. But if you don't want to know, you don't care, let those that do care, do want to know, come to the front. Let those, you move on the side, you play, you do your little TikToks, Kiki, do you love me? And let the ones that really want to educate and learn, so that we can build these bridges and bring these communities together. Because I know one thing I will say is, if there's anti-Blackness, in the Jewish community, which there is in America and probably everywhere else, I'm going to say it. If there's anti-Semitism in the Black community, I'm going to say it. Why not? Keep it real. Tell the truth. Stop playing games. And that's what I see so much on the internet. And that's my 2 pieces.
Thank you.
Well, I've definitely seen it from my own personal experiences, whether it's making any content or dealing with anyone within an organization that says that they want to start talking about these issues. Like education-wise, I've talked to organizations about this, and I've talked to them saying that you're only showcasing one. You're supposed to be showcasing all. And the response back, I can always say, it's this disinterested reply. There's not a will in my personal experience. So I've always said that there can be a lack of education, there could be a lack of communication, or like Kaya said, they're just lazy. They don't want to, from my personal experience. And it's difficult. It's very difficult to try and improve these structures, these organizations, these systems to educate Jewish youth, especially when there are people who, one, some of them don't really think we're even Jewish sometimes, or that we're dead communities like my own Jamaican Jewish community. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, oh, that community is still alive, it's still existing, it's still kicking, or the fact that a large majority of the Jamaican Jewish community is diverse. They're all colors of the rainbow within that community, and it's this hesitation to actually learn about these communities. So we can talk about, well, there's tons of access, but these people should be wanting to take that information and learning, but they're not. And I see it in my comments, I see it in my DMs, I see it all the time. That they just don't care, from my perspective.
So why not? What's fueling that? What's fueling the lack of will?
From what I've been told or what I've seen in responses, the number one thing is the invalidation of Jewishness. There are some people who spew the same type of language. They don't view us as Jews. They don't view me as a Jew, which hilarious, but whatever. And then other times it's just they don't even recognize the prejudice that they may hold when they say, well, there are other points of history that are more important to the Jewish narrative, the story, than you all. And again, on top of that, they're adding us all into one monolith, which is we're Black. But like we all have talked about, there are differences between Blackness. African American Jews will be different from Jamaican Jews. Jamaican Jews will be different from any other Jew in the Caribbean. It'll be different from the Ethiopian Jewish experience or any other African Jewish experience. And I've noticed that a lot of Jewish organizations were now moving away from education, but they just lump us all into one group and expect us to educate about Black Jewish culture, history, and then after that, that's done.
Or expect us to educate for free.
That too.
For free and
That
during
too.
Black History Month.
We doing real tonight. We doing real. Is that what we're gonna do?
Oh,
Yes. They want to hear. Let's keep it real. They want to hear our voice. They don't want to compensate for those voices where they're pulling people left and right. How you go? Listen.
And on top of it becomes a problem.
Who do we really want to be, and who do we really want to showcase? And sometimes it's just like, okay, and that's fine too. But you gotta bring those people in. There's no reason why you shouldn't have every one of these people on this panel shouldn't be, I know Noah does a lot of Yirmiyahu, but the brilliance, the mind, the amount of range, the amount of nuance, and it's actually, for me, especially sitting in Israel, it's quite hard to watch, and it's quite a shame. And I think that's part of the problem. If we're going to bridge these gaps, we've got to put whatever we got to bring some of the big chicken pieces out and let everybody else eat on it so that we can fix the situation. If not, we're going to be having the same conversation 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
I agree with everything that my colleagues just said. I just want to say that I'm incredibly excited to see this group of such talented and motivated educators in one room. And I think that means we have so much potential to have such an impact on the Jewish discourse right now. Whether they want to hear us or not, that's not relevant. We're going to make them listen, right? And the way that we make them listen is we have to be at one step ahead of the people that don't want to listen to us, the people that want to write us out of the textbooks, want to write us out of the curriculum, that, want to basically deny our Jewishness, right? And so as long as we know how these systems function and we can analyze them and create a strategy to rise above them, I think we'll be in a good place. And I think that specifically, since we're talking about where people are getting their education from, 50% of Gen Z are getting their news from TikTok. So we need to know that there are these nodes of communication in which people get enthralled, where it identifies their bias and only gives them things to confirm their bias, whether it's about some type of political issue or the type of Jewish voices and experiences that they want to hear. And so we need to know how to break out of those nodes of communication and to touch people that otherwise wouldn't have heard us. I don't know how many times, in addition to all the hate and everything that my colleagues just referenced, I can't tell you how many times I've had people message me like, I can't believe I'm only coming across your content right now. Right. And it's because of these algorithms. It's because of these strategies and these structures. So what I think that as painful as the current reality is, I'm incredibly inspired and motivated by the voices that are all coming here together right now. And I think that us working together, expanding this network is the path forward.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
obviously agree.
Amen.
Yeah,
Well
absolutely, Yirmiyahu. I, like, for every single person that there is that doesn't care, there's at least 2 or 3 that do. And I do see people out here really trying to do the work. Like, I do consulting for Jewish organizations, and one of the organizations I've worked with is Contra Costa Midrashah, and they have created a curriculum for or I helped them create the curriculum, but they've created a curriculum for their 8th grade class that really focuses on Jewish peoplehood and bringing in these stories of other communities in the diaspora and relating that to the politic of the Americas, but like not only just rooted in the trauma. I think that any time that I'm asked to speak in Jewish spaces, it's mostly rooted in trauma. People don't care about my joy and what I like to do, or that I paint pictures and I like to have plants in my house. And nobody ever asks me about that. And I'd also like to make sure that these spaces that we're creating to have these conversations are not just trauma fests, and they're also rooted in joy and personhood. I think that so often we get reduced to our negative experiences because they're so sensational and people want to hear about them. But and I think that there's an important context for those conversations to be had. I also think that for every conversation we have about our trauma, we need to have about our joy, because I think that the other thing that separates out African American Jews, especially from other communities like Jamaican Jews and Ethiopian Jews, is that we don't really have a genesis to our identity. Like, we all spring up kind of individually. We don't have a community in the same way that there's a B'nai Israel, or there's the Yemeni community. And and I think that the challenge is because we don't see ourselves reflected in the larger context of Jewish identity and peoplehood. And the more we can showcase that, the more we do develop a genesis, and the more we can expand conversations around Blackness beyond, and in that very Pan-African sense, or universal sense of Blackness, where everyone who has identified as Black is seen in that understanding of who Black people are.
I love that.
I love it too.
Thank you.
I love it too. I love it so much. I just want to jump in. Shakina, thank you so much, because I really, this is what I do love about being Black. I know that in the event that there is some, God forbid, police shooting or some crime or something, I know there's a Black barbecue. I know there's a party. And what I see a lot with Jewish creators is that there's so much woe is me. Where are your Shabbat tables? Where are your, I didn't see any, besides Rosh Hashanah, where are your juicy posts showing people who we are? Because every time that I've been on a Black site, people say, oh, the Jews, they're always complaining and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, who's complaining? No, there's joy. So I am all about showing that Jewish joy, because that's really who we are. That's really what is the meat of the Jewish person, in my opinion. So I love that, Shakina. Thank you for bringing that up about the Jewish joy.
I think the fact that we're all here is the highlight of that joy. And it doesn't have to be a sad story. We're here. And that's enough to celebrate. And not just here in the sense like we're alive and we made it, and thinking of all of our foremothers and forefathers that did what they had to do for us to actually be here, but that we're here right now on this live stream with our voices being heard and questions being asked and agreeing and disagreeing. And more of that type of diversity is what I hope we see moving forward. And I hope that we here on this panel contribute to. So I want to thank all of you for taking your time at the time out of your day to sit here with us and talk. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can contact any of us through JILV. Yes, this is recorded and will be available on the JILV YouTube page. So I just want to say thank you so much to everyone, and Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, guys.
Thank you. Toda rabah. Shavua Tov.
Thank you.